Hello, and welcome back to Storytime with Eric Zimmer. To be continued. And now we're on the next part of reading Matilda. Now, I'm going to read you the next 3 chapters, hopefully. Now, this is what happens when Matilda pays her father out for what he had said to her. You ready? All right, let's begin. The following morning, just before her Chapter 3, The Hat and the Superglue. The following morning, just before Mr. Wormwood left for his beastly second-hand garage, Matilda slipped into the cloakroom and got hold of the hat he wore each day to work. She had to stand on her toes and reach up as high as she could with a walking stick in order to hook the hat off the peg. And even then, she only just made it. The hat itself was one of those flat-topped pork pie jobs with a jay's feather stuck in the hat band, and Mr. Wormwood was very proud of it. He thought it gave him a rakish, daring look, especially when he wore it at an angle with his loud checked jacket and green tie. Matilda, holding the hat in one hand and a thin tube of superglue in the other, proceeded to squeeze a line of glue very neatly all around the inside rim of the hat. Then she carefully hooked the hat back onto the peg with the walking stick. She timed this operation very carefully, applying the glue just as her father was getting up from the breakfast table. So they do eat breakfast at the table. Mr. Wormwood didn't notice anything when he put the hat on, but when he arrived at the garage, he couldn't get it off. Superglue is very powerful stuff. So powerful it will take your skin off if you pull too hard. Remember that scene from the movie? Mr. Wormwood didn't want to be scalped, so he had to keep the hat on his head the whole day long, even when putting sawdust in gearboxes and fiddling the mileages of cars with his electric drill. In an effort to save face, he adopted a casual attitude, hoping that his staff would think that he actually meant to keep his hat on all day long, just for the heck of it, like gangsters do in the films. When he got home that evening, he still couldn't get the hat off. "Don't be silly," his wife said. "Come here, I'll take it off for you." She gave the hat a sharp yank. Mr. Wormwood let out a yell that rattled the window panes. "Ow!" he screamed. "Don't do that! Let go! You'll take half the skin off my forehead!" Matilda, nestling in her usual chair, was watching this performance over the rim of her book with some interest. "What's the matter, Daddy?" she said. "Has your head suddenly got swollen or something?" Mr. Wormwood glared at his daughter with deep suspicion, but said nothing. How could he? Mrs. Wormwood said to him, "It must be superglue. It couldn't be anything else. That'll teach you to go playing around with nasty stuff like that. I expect you were trying to stick another feather in your hat." "I haven't touched the blaming stuff!" Mr. Wormwood shouted. He turned and looked again at Matilda, who looked back at him with large, innocent brown eyes. Mrs. Wormwood said to him, "You should read the label on the tube before you start messing with dangerous products. Always follow the instructions on the label." "What in heaven's name are you talking about, you stupid witch?" Mr. Wormwood shouted, clutching the brim of his hat to stop anyone trying to pull it off again. "Do you think I'm so stupid I'd glue this thing to my head on purpose?" Matilda said, "There's a boy down the road who got some superglue on his finger without knowing it, and then he put his finger to his nose." Mr. Wormwood jumped. "What happened to him?" he spluttered. "The finger got stuck inside his nose," Matilda said, "and he had to go around like that for a week. People kept saying to him, 'Stop picking your nose,' and he couldn't do anything about it. He looked like an awful fool." "Serve him right," Mrs. Wormwood said. "He shouldn't have put his finger up there in the first place. It's a nasty habit." "It really is." "If all children had superglue put on their fingers, they'd soon stop doing it." Matilda said, "Grown-ups do it too, Mummy. I saw you doing it yesterday in the kitchen." "That's quite enough from you," Mrs. Wormwood said, turning pink. Mr. Wormwood had to keep his hat on all through supper in front of the television. He looked ridiculous, and he stayed very silent. When he went up to bed, he tried again to get the thing off, and so did his wife, but it wouldn't budge. "How am I going to have my shower?" he demanded. "You'll just have to do without it, won't you?" his wife told him. And later on, as she watched her skinny little husband skulking around the bedroom in his purple striped pajamas with a pork pie hat on his head, she thought how stupid he looked. Hardly the kind of man a wife dreams about, she told herself. Mr. Wormwood discovered that the worst thing about having a permanent hat on his head was having to sleep in it. It was impossible to lie comfortably on the pillow. "Now do stop fussing around," his wife said to him after he had been tossing and turning for about an hour. "I expect it will be loose by morning, and then it'll slip off easily." But it wasn't loose by the morning, and it wouldn't slip off. So Mrs. Wormwood took a pair of scissors and cut the whole thing off his head, bit by bit. First the top and then the brim. Where the inner band had stuck to the hair all around the sides and back, she had to chop the hair off right to the skin so that he finished up with a bald white ring around his head like some sort of monk. Oh, God. And in the front, where the band had stuck directly to the bare skin, there remained a whole lot of small patches of brown leathery stuff that no amount of washing would get off. At breakfast, Matilda said to him, "You must try to get those bits off your forehead, Daddy. It looks as though you've got little brown insects crawling about all over you. People will think you've got lice." "Be quiet," Mr. Wormwood shouted. "Just keep your nasty mouth shut, will you?" All in all, it was a most satisfactory exercise, but it was surely too much to hope that it had taught the father a permanent lesson. Chapter 4. The Ghost. There was a comparative calm in the Wormwood household for about a week after the superglue episode. The experience had clearly chastened Mr. Wormwood, and he seemed temporarily to have lost his taste for boasting and bullying. Then suddenly he struck again. Perhaps he had had a bad day at the garage and had not sold enough crummy second-hand cars. There are many things that make a man irritable when he arrives home from work in the evening, and a sensible wife will usually notice the storm signals and will leave him alone until he simmers down. When Mr. Wormwood arrived back from the garage that evening, his face was as dark as a thundercloud, and somebody was clearly going for the high jump pretty soon. His wife recognized the signs immediately and made herself scarce. He then strode into the living room. Matilda happened to be curled up in an armchair in the corner, totally absorbed in a book. Mr. Wormwood switched on the television. The screen lit up. The program blared. Mr. Wormwood glared at Matilda. She hadn't moved. She had somehow trained herself by now to block her ears to the ghastly sound of the dreaded box. She kept right on reading, and for some reason this infuriated Mr. Wormwood. Perhaps his anger was intensified because he saw her getting pleasure from something that was beyond his reach, and apparently his hair grew back. But "Don't you ever stop reading?" he snapped at her. "Oh, hello, Daddy," she said presently. "Did you have a good day?" "What is this trash?" he said, snatching the book from her hands. "It isn't trash, Daddy. It's lovely. It's called The Red Pony. It's by John Steinbeck, an American writer. Why don't you try it? You'll love it." "Filth," Mr. Wormwood said. "If it's by an American, it's certain to be filth. That's all they write about." Ha! On the other hand, a lot of American literature was inspired by English literature. But still. "No, Daddy, it's beautiful. Honestly, it is. It's about—" "I don't want to know what it's about," Mr. Wormwood barked. "I'm fed up with your reading anyway. Go and find yourself something useful to do." With frightening suddenness, he now began ripping the pages out of the book in handfuls and throwing them into the waste paper basket. Matilda froze in horror. Mr. Wormwood kept going. There seemed little doubt that the man felt some kind of jealousy. "How dare she?" he seemed to be saying with each rip of a page. "How dare she enjoy reading books when he couldn't? How dare she?" "That's a library book," Matilda cried. "It doesn't belong to me. I have to return it to Mrs. Phelps." "Then you'll have to buy another one, won't you?" Mr. Wormwood said, still tearing out pages. "You'll have to save your pocket money until there's enough in the kitty to buy a new one for your precious Mrs. Phelps, won't you?" With that, he dropped the now empty covers of the book into the basket and marched out of the room, leaving the telly blaring. Most children in Matilda's place would have burst into floods of tears. She didn't do this. She sat there very still and white and thoughtful. She seemed to know that neither crying nor skulking ever got anyone anywhere. The only sensible thing to do when you are attacked is, as Napoleon Bonaparte once said, to counterattack. Matilda's wonderfully subtle mind was already at work devising yet another suitable punishment for the poisonous parent. The plan that was now beginning to hatch in her mind depended, however, upon whether or not Fred's parrot was really as good a talker as Fred made out. Fred was a friend of Matilda's. He was a small boy of 6 who lived just around the corner from her, and for days he had been going on about this great talking parrot his father had given him. So the following afternoon, as soon as Mrs. Wormwood had departed in her car for another session of bingo, Matilda set out for Fred's house to investigate. She knocked on his door and asked if he would be kind enough to show her the famous bird. Fred was delighted and led her up to his bedroom, where a truly magnificent blue and yellow parrot sat in a tall cage. "There it is," Fred said. "His name is Chopper. Make it talk," Matilda said. "You can't make it talk," Fred said. "You have to be patient. It'll talk when it feels like it." They hung around waiting. Suddenly the parrot said, "Hello, hello, hello." It was exactly like a human voice. Matilda said, "That's amazing. What else can it say?" "Rattle my bones," the parrot said, giving a wonderful imitation of a spooky voice. "Rattle my bones." "He's always saying that," Fred told her. "What else can he say?" Matilda asked. "That's about it," Fred said. "But it is pretty marvelous, don't you think?" "It's fabulous," Matilda said. "Will you lend him to me just for one night?" "No," Fred said. "Certainly not." "I'll give you all my next week's pocket money," Matilda said. That was different. Fred thought about it for a few seconds. "All right then," he said, "if you promise to return him tomorrow." Matilda staggered back to her own empty house, carrying the toll cage in both hands. There was a large fireplace in the dining room, and she now set about wedging the cage up the chimney and out of sight. This wasn't so easy, but she managed it in the end. "Hello, hello, hello," the bird called down to her. "Hello, hello, hello." "Shut up, you nut," Matilda said, and she went out to wash the soot off her hands. That evening, while her father, mother, and brother, and Matilda were having supper as usual in the living room in front of the television, a voice came out and clear from the dining room across the hall. "Hello, hello, hello," it said. "Harry!" cried Mrs. Wormwood, turning white. "There's something in the house. I heard a voice." "So did I," Michael said. Matilda jumped up and switched off the telly. "Shh," she said. "Listen." They all stopped eating and sat there very tense, listening. "Hello, hello, hello," came the voice again. "There it is," cried Michael. "It's burglars," hissed Mrs. Wormwood. "They're in the dining room." "I think they are," Mr. Wormwood said, sitting tight. "Then go and catch them, Harry," hissed Mrs. Wormwood. "Go out and collar them red-handed." Mr. Wormwood didn't move. He seemed in no hurry to dash off and be a hero. His face had turned gray. "Get on with it," hissed Mrs. Wormwood. "They're probably after the silver." Mr. Wormwood wiped his lips nervously with his napkin. "Why don't we all go and look together?" he said. "Come on, then," Michael said. "Come on, Mom." "They're definitely in the dining room," Matilda whispered. "I'm sure they are." Mrs. Wormwood grabbed a poker from the fireplace. Mr. Wormwood took a golf club that was standing in the corner. Michael seized a table lamp, ripping the plug out of its socket. Matilda took the knife she had been eating with, and all four of them crept towards the dining room door. Mr. Wormwood kept keeping well behind the others. What a coward. "Hello, hello, hello," came the voice again. "Come on," Matilda said as she burst into the room brandishing her knife. "Stick 'em up," she yelled. "We've caught you." The others followed her, waving their weapons. Then they stopped. They stared around the room. There was no one there. "There's no one here," Mr. Wormwood said, greatly relieved. "I heard him, Harry," Mrs. Wormwood shrieked, still quaking. "I distinctly heard his voice. So did you." "I'm certain I heard him," Matilda cried. "He's in there somewhere. He's in here somewhere." Matilda began searching behind the sofa and behind the curtains. Then came the voice again, soft and spooky this time. "Rattle my bones," it said. "Rattle my bones." They all jumped, including Matilda, who was a pretty good actress. They stared round the room. There was still no one there. It's a ghost, Matilda said. Heaven help us, cried Mrs. Wormwood, clutching her husband around the neck. I know it's a ghost, Matilda said. I've heard it here before. This room is haunted. I thought you knew that. Save us, Mrs. Wormwood screamed, almost throttling her husband. I'm getting out of here, Mr. Wormwood said, grayer than ever now. They all fled, slamming the door behind them. The next afternoon, Matilda managed to get a rather sooty and grumpy parent down from the chimney and out of the house without being seen. I hope you cleaned him first. She carried it through the back door and ran with it all the way to Fred's house. Did it behave itself? Fred asked her. We had a lovely time with it, Matilda said. My parents adored it. If he only knew. If he only knew. Chapter 5. Arithmetic. For those who don't know, that's another word for math. Matilda had longed for her parents to be good and loving and understanding and honorable and intelligent. The fact that they were none of these things was something she had to put up with. It was not easy to do so, but the new game she had invented of punishing one or both of them each time they were beastly to her made her life more or less bearable. Being very small and very young, the only power Matilda had over anyone in her family was brain power. For sheer cleverness, she could run rings around them all. But the fact remained that any 5-year-old girl in any family was always obliged to do as she was told, however asinine the orders might be. Thus she was always forced to eat her evening meals out of TV dinner trays in front of the dreaded box. She always had to stay alone on weekday afternoons, and whenever she was told to shut up, she had to shut up. Her safety valve, the thing that prevented her from going round the bend, was the fun of devising and dishing out these splendid punishments, and the lovely thing was that they seemed to work, at any rate for short periods. Mr. Wormwood in particular became less cocky and unbearable for several days after receiving a dose of Matilda's magic medicine. The parrot in the chimney affair quite definitely cooled both parents down a lot, and for over a week they were comparatively civil to their small daughter. But alas, this couldn't last. The next flare-up came one evening in the sitting room. Mr. Wormwood had just returned from work. Matilda and Michael were sitting quietly on the sofa, waiting for Mrs. Wormwood to bring in the TV dinners on a tray. The television had not yet been switched on. In came Mr. Wormwood, in a loud check suit and a yellow tie. The appalling broad orange and green check of the jacket and trousers almost blinded the onlooker. He looked like a low-grade bookmaker dressed up for his daughter's wedding, and he was clearly very pleased with himself this evening. He sat down in an armchair and rubbed his hands together and addressed his son in a loud voice. Well, my boy, he said, your father's had a most successful day. He's a lot richer tonight than he was this morning. He has sold no less than 5 cars, each one at a tiny profit. Sawdust in the gearboxes, the electric drill on the speedometer, cables, a splash of paint here and there, and a few other clever little tricks, and the idiots were all falling over themselves to buy. He fished out a bit of paper from his pocket and studied it. Listen, my boy, he said, addressing Michael and ignoring Matilda. Seeing as you'll be going into this business with me one day, you've got to know how to add up the profits you make at the end of each day. Go get yourself a pad and a pencil, and let's see how clever you are. Michael obediently left the room and returned with the writing materials. Write down these figures, Mr. Wormwood said, reading from his bit of paper. Car number 1 was bought by me for £278 and sold for £1,425. Got that? The 10-year-old boy wrote the 2 separate amounts down slowly and carefully. Car number 2, Mr. Wormwood went on, cost me £118 and sold for $760. Got it? Yes, Dad, Michael said. I got that. Car number 3 cost £111 and sold for £999.50. Say that again, Michael said. How much did it sell for? £999.50, Mr. Wormwood said. And that, by the way, is another of my nifty little tricks to diddle the customer. Never ask for a big round figure. Always go just below it. Never say £1,000. Always say $999.50. It sounds much less, but it isn't. Clever, isn't it? Very, Michael said. You're brilliant, Dad. Car number 4 cost £86, a real wreck that was, and sold for £699.50. Not too fast, Michael said. writing the numbers down. Right, I got it. Car number 5 cost £637 and sold for $1,649.50. You got all those figures written down, son? Yes, Daddy, Michael said, crouching over his pad and carefully writing. Very well, Mr. Wormwood said. Now work out the profit I made on each of the 5 cars and add up the total. Then you'll be able to tell me how much money your rather brilliant father made altogether today. That's a lot of sums, Michael said. Of course it's a lot of sums, Mr. Wormwood answered. But when you're in big business like I am, you've got to be hot stuff at arithmetic. I practically got a computer inside my head. It took me less than 10 minutes to work the whole thing out. You mean you got it in your head, Dad? Michael asked, goggling. Well, not exactly, Mr. Wormwood said. Nobody could do that. Huh. But it didn't take me long. When you're finished, tell me what you think my profit was for the day. I got the final total written down here, and I'll tell you if you're right. Matilda said quietly, Dad, you made exactly £4,303.50 altogether. Don't butt in, Mr. Wormwood said. Your brother and I are busy with high finance. But Dad... Shut up, Mr. Wormwood said. Stop guessing and trying to be clever. Look at your answer, Dad, Matilda said gently. If you've done it right, it ought to be £4,303.50. Is that what you've got, Dad? Mr. Wormwood glanced down at the paper in his hand. He seemed to stiffen. He became very quiet. There was a silence. Then he said, Say that again. £4,303.50, Matilda said. And I did the calculations earlier. That is correct. And that includes subtracting how much the cars cost before he sold them. There was another silence. Mr. Wormwood's face was beginning to go dark red. I'm sure it's right, Matilda said. You little cheat! Mr. Wormwood suddenly shouted, pointing at her with his finger. You looked at my bit of paper. You read it off from what I've got written here. Daddy, I'm on the other side of the room, Matilda said. How could I possibly see it? Don't give me that rubbish, Mr. Wormwood shouted. Of course you looked. You must have looked. No one in the world could give the right answer just like that, especially a girl. Huh. You are a little cheat, madam. That's what you are. A cheat and a liar. At that point, Mrs. Wormwood came in carrying a large tray on which there were 4 suppers. This time it was fish and chips, which Mrs. Wormwood had picked up in the fish and chip shop on her way home from bingo. Chips are French fries. That's what the British call them. It seemed that bingo afternoons had left her so exhausted, both physically and emotionally, that she never had enough energy left to cook an evening meal. So if it wasn't TV dinners, it had to be fish and chips. What are you looking so red in the face about, Harry? She said as she put the tray down on the coffee table. Your daughter's a cheat and a liar, Mr. Wormwood said, taking his plate of fish and placing it on his knees. Turn the telly on, and let's not have any more talk. To be continued. See you next time on Story Time with Eric Zimmer.